Chapter 1. The Piper Aztec flew out of the clouds, and the jagged green mass of Elephant Island appeared beneath the nose, dead ahead. Long ages since, huge volcanic forces had thrust its mountains from the seabed, their crests streaming lava and plumes of sulphurous smoke in the South Pacific trades. Then the gentler but no less determined forces of wind and rain had moulded it, bringing and nurturing the seeds that had clothed it in luxuriant forests, and the rivers to cut deep valleys through the ranges, washing down the silt of millennia to fill the wide swamps at the eastern end. And now, to this indolent and undemanding home of primitive men was coming a force of change, mightier than lava and earthquake, fire and landslide. Dr. Sidney Prout, PhD London, and sometime lecturer in sociology at Manchester, was the head of the United Nations mission to Elephant Island. Incredibly emaciated, his gaunt frame was crowned with a bony head whose chief features were a covering of ginger bristles on the scalp and two piercing eyes. "There she is," said Ross McLennan, the pilot. "Elephant Island." "But there aren't any elephants in the Pacific. What a ridiculous name." "There was once. Belonged to Blackbird McGarvey, old-time skipper. Fell for the chief's daughter, but her old man sized up his schooner and reckoned a man with a canoe that big could cough up with one hell of a big pig for his daughter. Blackbird tried every dodge he could think of to get the girl, but it was no go. The chief had it stuck in his head that the white man had everything bigger than the brown man and wanted his cut. Well, Blackbird was stumped for a time till one day he was in Sydney when the circus was in town. They had a sick young elephant and wanted to unload it on some sucker, which was Blackbird. He paid a fortune for it, clapped it in the hold, brought it out here, put on his top hat and fancy waistcoat, and led it out on the beach to claim his beloved. The locals took one look and shit themselves. Took off into the bush and didn't come out for a month. He never got the girl neither. She'd pissed off with her old man, and Blackbird got clobbered by a typhoon and his ship went down with all hands. Unlucky sort of bloke, really. What happened to the elephant? Dunno. I suppose the locals kai-kai'd it when they worked up enough guts for the job. These coastal bastards look good enough on a picture postcard, but one whiff of a mountain man, and they're up the palm trees so fast you'd think there was red-hot pokers up their bums. Prout frowned. The crudely contemptuous racialism of the pilot came as a shock, even though he had read about such attitudes in the Journal of Race Relations. He adroitly diverted the conversation into more strictly sociological channels. These mountain people, are they as ferocious as their reputations? Oh yeah, they're a rough mob all right. They're called Morocks, but Rog has 'em pretty well tamed. Gets on with 'em well too. Rog? He's the RM, resident magistrate. Roger Fletcher's his name. They call him Roaring Roger around here. Good bloke when you get to know him. Very practical. Prout pursed his lips. Practical. Anyone whom the likes of McLennan called practical almost certainly despised sociology and was prone to ignoring the proper administrative procedure. Well, from what we've heard in New York, he doesn't seem to have been very successful. That's why we're taking over. Yeah, I heard you blokes were giving Australia the push. You don't reckon we're up for the job, is that it? Oh no, not at all. But unfortunately, Australia has allowed an unqualified and really a very reactionary man to have his own way with the island for so long that no social or economic progress has been made at all. At this stage in the process of decolonisation, Australia feels it would be less embarrassing for her if the United Nations assumed the responsibility for preparing the Indigenous people for independence. That's why I'm here. Ross digested this information and being, like most professional pilots, a resigned and imperturbable man, he said nothing. He merely cut back the power and put the aircraft into a shallow descent, to take them over the coastline at an altitude of 5,000 feet. The airstrip's up in the mountains around 3,000 feet up. Climate's bloody terrible on the coast, all mozzies and swamp. The Yanks were here during the war and put this strip up in the Ungabunga, but the RMs always lived there. By the way, we're just flying over Byron Bay now. Don't tell me that Lord Byron came here looking for a wife too. The pilot flashed him an amused grin. No, nothing like that. Just the first RM. Carstairs. A bloody loony. They all seem to end up here. This one had a thing about the great poets. Have a look at the chart. Ruddy poets' names all over. As they passed over the beaches below, Ross brought the nose of the plane up and boosted the power to check their descent, then levelled out. The great peaks of Shakespeare and Milton rose ahead of them, with Wordsworth a little to the rear. Even at 11 in the morning, clouds were drifting near the summits. They flew on in silence, and Prout surveyed his new responsibilities as they passed below. Near the coast were a few scattered villages among the mangrove and sago swamps that were cut into fragments of lagoon by the greasy waters of the Ungabunga River as it moved slowly towards the open sea, dully reflecting the sun. Up ahead were the ranges, monotonously green, upon whose flanks was not the smallest indication of human habitation or activity. As they reached the point where the Ungabunga debouched from its mountain prison, Ross banked the plane and they turned into the valley, which had somehow escaped the literary ravages of the first resident magistrate. The spurs began to rise beneath them, and soon Prout could see tiny settlements of leaf-thatched huts and scattered gardens in the forest. And along the backs of ridges he saw spidery tracks of red clay that stood out clearly against the green. In the bottom of the valley foamed the waters of the Ungabunga. The walls of the valley were rising steadily around them, and after a few minutes, Ross banked to the left and turned into the tributary gorge. Soon he pointed to a spur below them, on Prout's side, and shouted, "Ungabunga!" 2,000 feet below them, the strip could be plainly seen, overshadowed at one end and along one side by the almost vertical wall of the mountainside, with a precipice dropping sheer into the river at the other end by the windsock. At the top of the strip under the mountain was a stockaded fort with various buildings inside, while more structures lined the side of the strip along the mountain wall. But even at this height, it was obvious that their arrival was unexpected, to say the least. The strip was occupied by what appeared to be two ranks of people facing each other, with another group at the fortress end. Ross let down some flap and put the plane into a left-hand circuit, which obscured Prout's view, but as they circled lower, they saw the two ranks charge together and begin hacking at each other with barbaric vigor. By the time Ross had brought the plane down to 1,000 feet above the strip, they could see that the parties to the dispute were small, furious, dark-skinned men clad in feathers, busily engaged in battering the daylights out of each other with wooden clubs. "It seems that I've arrived only just in time," Prout commented thoughtfully. Chapter 2. At dawn, while Prout was still abed in Rabaul, the villages of Neovoro and Lava Lava had already begun the 15-mile hike down the track from their mountain refuge to Ungabunga. The path swung down among the spurs and creeks, steadily descending, an even red ribbon of law and order against the jungle above and below it, blasted and hacked under government orders 20 years before, but still wide enough to allow a horse or a motorbike to pass, and of course the silent feet of the Marocs. Although it was officially the dry season, there had been heavy rain in the night, and the grass beside the track sparkled with unfallen drops that drenched the legs of the men as they thrust their way past. The night air still lay cold in the valleys, and breath came in clouds. They were small men, mountain men, the corded muscles of their legs knotted and stressed by years of merciless exertion on mountainside and track. Their heads were brilliant with a plumage of cockatoo and bird of paradise, and their faces were painted with vivid ochres and stained with the juices of wild berries. But their eyes gleamed coldly beneath heavy and protruding brows. Through their hooked, pendulous noses were thrust the curving tusks of the wild boar, whose points swept up towards the glittering manic eyes. Around their waists were girdles of human thigh bones. The hurrying files of men bristled with bows, bunches of arrows, some tipped with scrap iron, quivering spears of the black palmwood, serrated and barbed to rip the boughs of enemies, and clubs, smooth clubs for braining pigs, knotted and gnarled clubs for settling the private scores in a single smashing blow, stone clubs, cut into discs for taking a man's head off at the neck, or into the shape of pineapples, to splinter limb bones, and many carried bamboo beheading knives, hardened in the fire and blackened by use. Some weapons were new and untried, but others were old companions in many bloody skirmish and rout, and had names, like trusty dogs, Skull Cracker, Old Blinder, Beg for Mercy, and Bloody Ruin. These were all clubs and spears whose fame had been shouted at 100 dances or more. Little groups of women, each wearing several string bags of sweet potato and other vegetables on her back that was suspended from her forehead, moved with the men. They were dowdy creatures, as dour as their menfolk, but without the manic gleam that lighted their husbands' countenances. The breasts of the more mature were flat and sagging, flapping against their chests as they bent forward into their loads. As the file of men and women drew near the station, groups of them began to congregate by the streams that ran across the track, washing the mud from their legs, and in the case of the men, attending to each other's makeup, a finger full of red ochre for an eyebrow, the juice of the mirimar berry to give lustre to the forehead, a streak of white clay for the nose. The sun, though now well risen, had not yet driven off the mists of all the ridges. At intervals came the drawn-out cries of men calling to one another from spur to spur along the cliffside track. Those strange, echoing cries, wailing through the mists and gorges, seemed to have little that was human in them. At Ungabunga, Roger Fletcher, the resident magistrate of Her Britannic Majesty's possession of Elephant Island, warden of the goldfields, justice of the peace, receiver of wrecks, comptroller of excises, coroner, and high bailiff, leaned over the veranda of his fort and spat on a lizard. He had come to the end of his cigarette, and the rusty-browned, scuttling creature, sunning itself beside the steps, was the most satisfying target he could find for a fat gob of nicotine-flavoured spit. He was a man in his late 30s, of nearly 6 foot and broad, with black hair and a beard in which beads of sweat trickled and glistened. His eyes were blue, his hands were thrust into his khaki riding breeches, the fly of which was broken and permanently exposed. The breeches ended in gaitered brown boots, while the upper part of his body was clad in a khaki shirt, topped off by an army surplus bush hat. A cigarette of native tobacco rolled in newspaper hung, as usual, from his lips, emitting a smell which most people encounter only at burning rubbish dumps, the unmistakable aroma of smouldering mattresses and blackened tins. He liked it, especially on the first Monday in the mouth, which was Land Dispute Day at Ungabunga. "Who's on the card today, Ollie?" he shouted, half turning his head towards the door of the office which led off the veranda. His voice was harsh and grating. In the gloom of the office, a vast white shape, like a slug in a bell tent, as Fletcher described it, slowly stirred. Ulrich's assistant resident magistrate was shifting his 23-stone bulk in its strengthened cigar wood chair, the better to consult the schedule of land disputes and see which villages were settling their differences that day. Niavoro and Lava Lava seemed to be the only ones listed, he called. Sapo and Ganipa scratched on account of the dysentery. He resumed his work on the compilation of some fictitious venereal disease returns for the police, a task which on this occasion called for unusual finesse. Unlike Fletcher, Ulrichs had a marked aversion to physical exercise, dressed entirely in white silk, and had seldom walked a step in the last 10 years, preferring the amenities of his sedan chair and its 4 groaning bearers recruited from the jail. There were no shortage of them. To volunteer as bearer for the assistant resident magistrate automatically earned the local lawbreakers a half remission of sentence. When in the office, Ulrich devoted his not inconsiderable intellect to compiling fraudulent returns on every item of station equipment, from asbestos blankets to zinc ointment, and fictitious reports on social, political, economic, educational, moral, agricultural, sanitary, religious, and meteorological progress to a mercifully distant department in Canberra. When not in the office, he devoted the same single-minded attention to eating, either as a guest of Madame Negretti at the Cosmopolitan Hotel, Ungabunga's only pub, or in his own exquisite quarters, where his furnishings were sumptuous, his cellar Catholic, and his hospitality proverbial. The government office was a highly defensible structure of mud and timber, loopholed for rifle fire in all directions, and surrounded by a high stockade and a ditch. The only entrance, facing the airstrip, was guarded by a timber gatehouse and closed at night. Within the stockade were storehouses, armory and orderly room and guard room, with a well. Above all flew the Australian flag, below the small hill on which it stood, and to the left, the jail, barracks for the police, the pub, a trade store, a few houses for the European residents, and a clutter of native hovels. The airstrip was now rapidly filling with natives from Lava Lava and Niavoro, and hundreds of spectators from other villages. The police, resplendent in spiked helmets, were waving cavalry sabres and disarming the combatants as they entered the station at the far end of the airstrip, and piling their weapons in heaps. The weapons were kept under police guard, although the natives received cudgels as replacements and were allowed to keep their shields. The men of Lava Lava and Niavoro, driven by the curses of the police, were separated into their respective groups, facing each other across the strip, from which positions they began bombarding each other with obscene repartee, slapping their bare buttocks in derision. Their women, from the spectators' area, urged them on to atrocious acts. 4 mounted constables on horses patrolled the space between the contending parties to prevent any unsporting attempt to begin the proceedings before the arrival of the umpire. On the veranda of the office, Fletcher had been joined by Ulrich, but they were almost instantly interrupted by the thudding of nailed boots up the steps and along the veranda. The sergeant major was coming to report all correct for the first event of the day, and to request the presence of the resident magistrate. 18 stone and 6 feet, 4 inches of Binandir warrior crashed to attention before the resident magistrate, hand quivering at the salute, spike of helmet glinting, pace stick rigid under arm, little piggy eyes glaring into middle distance, the dust settling around the huge black boots of an angle of 45 degrees and casting a faint haze over the winking gloss of the toe caps. Once he had been a tribesman from New Guinea, but now he was the tribe of sergeant majors, found wherever a flagstaff flies the Union Jack, who dream not of crocodiles and sorcery, but of metal polish and fire buckets, defaulters, parades, and idle kit. All he come, sir. All Kanaka on parade. Very good, carry on, Sergeant Major. Fletcher returned the salute. The Sergeant Major about turned and signalled to the garrison buglers, who began their flourishes as the RM made their way behind the Sergeant Major's stately tread to the rostrum outside the stockade. Once he was seated under the brilliant canopy fashioned from a cargo of gaudy second-hand underwear intended for a missionary congregation in the Solomons, but piously diverted by Ulrichs as being dangerous to their faith and morals, the bugles fell silent, and the proper business of the day begun. The 2 chiefs of Lava Lava and Niavoro, Abuk and Deng, approached the dais and attempted to salute. The sergeant major, standing rigidly at attention by the steps, shuddered and wished fervently to have them in his drill squad for the whole hot afternoon. "O Tikami," said Abuk in the Morocco language, which Fletcher spoke fluently, "O Tikami, thou well knowest these dung piles of Niavoro, how their women stink so foul that only the wild boars of the forest can abide to mount them, how the cods of their young men hang tiny and shriveled like the smallest finger of an aged crone, how they feed their guests on dogs' turds now, and now—" His voice rose to a shriek of anguished rage. "These half-men, these bush pigs, dare to claim the sacred land of our fathers, the land called Arafura, bounded by the pandanus palms and the lava river of me and my brothers. Thou knowest well, O mighty Tikami, that words of truth fall as often from the lips of men like these as riches from the asses of our pigs. Give us leave, then, to smite this offal uttering to destroy them, and drive them from thy sight, that even their pigs shall flee them for shame." "What sayest thou, O Deng?" Fletcher looked to the chief of the Niavoro. Deng, half of whose face had been smashed in by a club when he was young, and who had been gazing at Abuk in silent contempt during his frenzied harangue, produced a handful of feathers from behind his back and replied, "O Tikami, we men of Niavoro, heed not these bird songs of the lava lava, for the lava lava are like unto these feathers, that when the wind bloweth upon them, are scattered over the earth, and are seen no more." He blew the feathers away, and they were taken up by the wind. "That is all my speech. Let us to arms, O Tikami." "So be it," said Fletcher, waving them back to their places to await his signal. The two chiefs departed to the ranks of their men, and the RM welcomed a number of Europeans onto the dais, including Ulrichs, who had just arrived in his creaking palanquin. Tikami was the mightiest of the Morocco folk heroes, half man, half spirit, who had roamed their mountains in the dawn of antiquity, a great hunter, lawgiver, and breaker of heads. The Moroccs were convinced that Fletcher was a reincarnation of his prepotent being, an illusion that he did nothing to dispel. But native philosophers had been much exercised to find a place in their scheme of things for Ulrichs. Clearly, he was the inseparable companion of Tikami. He was not his wife, equally clearly, and he seemed to spend his life in eating. Garang, the greatest philosopher of the Moroccs, had spent many fruitless hours alone on his rock, high above the Lama Ipa River, attempting to precisely reconcile these curious features of the relationship between Tikami and his oversized companion. One afternoon, it was the dry season, when men scurried up and down the tracks with new timbers for garden fences, and women sang to their babies as they gathered up the dried underbrush for burning, and the great valleys were full of hazy smoke from the grass fires. The truth dawned upon Garang. Of course, the legend told that Tikami did have a male companion, his inseparable comforter, vast in bulk and fathomlessly cunning. It had been his great pig, a buraboo. The true identity of Ulrichs was discovered at last. Amazing, thought Garang, as he made his way back to the men's house in his village to spread the news of his revelation. Amazing how one can penetrate the red men's secrets if one only thinks clearly and patiently. They're almost human. Fletcher and Ulrichs were joined on the dais by the other Europeans of the station. Smith, the doctor, Madame Negretti, proprietress of the Cosmopolitan Hotel, Ned Oakley, a gold miner down for the weekend from his camp at Armpit Creek, and Ernie English, storekeeper and airline agent. Smith, who was really Vladislaw Prislawski, a cheerful Pole who had been rechristened Smith on his arrival by Fletcher, who refused to have a bloody disgusting set of noises like that on me clean station register. Although Smith was a doctor, his real interests lay in the dead, not the living, since the focus of his life was pathology. Every morning his eyes roamed over the patients in his dispensary, as they lolled against the grime-encrusted shiny plaster walls, probing each hopefully in turn for some sign of mortal decay, some festering lesion in a vital organ that would bring them swiftly to his mortuary slab, and perhaps to the ultimate distinction of the pickling jar, most of which came from Madame Negretti's kitchen when she could find no fruit suitable for bottling. His autopsies, at which sherry was served, were one of the few bright spots of the Ungabunga social calendar. Madame Negretti was an Italian lady of ample proportions, the widow of a sea captain, with beady eyes but a jolly sense of humour. Her hobbies were cooking, at which she was superb, and knitting, at which she was exceedingly bad. In moments of agitation, her cardigans and bed jackets were apt to disintegrate into a mess of tangled cordage and broken spars, resembling the rigging of one of Nelson's ships of the line after the prolonged fleet action. Ned Oakley was a small, intensely respectable gold miner who wore spectacles and came into Ungabunga once a month on Land Dispute Day to pick up his grub from the store, his copies of the Tablet and the Chess World, and a case of rum, and to watch the conflicts being resolved, for he prided himself on having a connoisseur's eye for a good scrap. Ernie English came from God knows where. No one knew much about his past, since he was always drunk by 10 in the morning, and his steady consumption of rum made conversation between then and bedtime rather laborious. As soon as the official party was comfortably seated, Fletcher rose and drew his revolver. The police on the strip observed his action and galloped furiously to safety as he raised the weapon and fired a single shot. Its reverberations were drowned by a mighty yell as the two ranks of frenzy mountain men, their gaping mouths dripping red with beetle juice and lifted to heaven as they howled aimlessly, rushed forward to lock themselves in combat. Cudgels rose and fell, and feather headdresses flew like chaff on the threshing floor. Scalps split, and blood splattered over the arms and shoulders, and mingled with the ochres and clays on the faces of the warriors. But most of the blows were taken on the shields, and sounded like heavy rain on a palm leaf roof. At first the men of Lava Lava, urged on by the wild shouts of Abuk, pressed the warriors of Neovoro back under the furious impulse of their charge. The ranks swayed this way and that, each side struggling for mastery, but suddenly, under the cool leadership of Deng, the men of Neovoro changed their tactics. Deng and his picked warriors at the center began delivering devastating body thrusts at the vitals of their enemies, many of whom collapsed, writhing and clutching themselves. The Lava Lava center weakened, and in a trice was broken by the Neovoro vanguard. Abuk went down to a particularly vicious thrust from Ajiek, brother to the wife of Deng, and the Lava Lava, now split in two, turned aside from the furious assault. The Neovoro cudgels fell instead on kidneys and elbows and thwacked across muscular buttocks as the Lava Lava broke and ran before the final colossal charge, flinging away cudgels and shields as they sprinted for safety to the drainage ditch at the side of the strip. The Neovoro, in the heat of the charge, would have followed up their advantage and well rubbed in their victory with iron fence posts, rocks, and broken bottles, but the police, anticipating them, fired a volley over the heads of the winners with their shotguns, bringing the Neovoro to a halt. Dust rising in clouds around them, now cheerful and exultantly throwing their cudgels in derision after their scattering foes. It was only then, as the shouting died, that everyone became aware of the plane circling low overhead. Chapter 3. Ross turned the plane onto final approach and they glided in across the gorge of the Ungabunga 1,000 feet below. Prout froze as the plane dropped suddenly, and it seemed that they would undershoot and crash into the cliff below at the end of the strip. But Ross maintained height and aimed for a point well beyond the threshold. A gust of crosswind swung the aircraft for a second, but he dipped his wing and held a straight course with rudder until his main wheels touched, then taxied up the strip, with a burst of power to take the plane over a few hundred feet to its parking position opposite the trade store. As the propellers tick-tocked to a halt, Prout flung open the door and stepped out onto the wing, looking about him. Much to his surprise, after the miniature Armageddon he had witnessed from the air, everything now seemed peaceful. He felt vaguely that his own presence might already have begun to have a steadying effect. And the greater the chaos at the beginning of his administration, the greater would be his credit for restoring order. His speculations were rudely disrupted by the arrival of Ernie, who was by now in the cheerful stage of his alcoholic trajectory and had come to carry out his duties as airline agent. Seeing a lonely figure poised hesitantly upon the wing, Ernie's first thought was to assist the obviously nervous passenger to alight. Staggering forward, he clumsily embraced Prout's ankles. "You just put your foot here, mate." The next second, Prout found himself overbalanced. Ernie crumpled beneath the unexpected weight and fell flat on his back as gravity drove one of Prout's bony knees into a sensitive part of the drunkard's anatomy. In response, Ernie vomited, noisily and copiously over Prout's legs. As Prout scrambled to his feet, green and trembling, his brow dewed with sweat, Fletcher and Smith came up. "Geez, I'm sorry, mate," groaned Ernie. "Didn't mean to hurl all over your strides like that. Just trying to help." Clutching himself with one hand, he knelt up and tried to wipe his breakfast from Prout's grey flannels with the other. Prout looked down, horror-stricken. "Yeah, bloody good chunder, Ernie," broke in Fletcher. "But you'd better leave the laundry business to Angelina." He held out his hand to Prout, who took it limply. "I'm Roger Fletcher, resident magistrate, and this is Smithy, the doc." "I'm Sydney Prout, United Nations Special Commissioner." "G'day. We've been expecting you. You better come over to the pub. There's a shower there. One of the boys will fetch your gear. Look after Ern, Smithy." They began to walk over to the pub. "Did you have a good trip?" "Very smooth, thank you." "Yeah, good. Well, we'll have plenty of time to talk later on today after dinner." They had reached the hotel, built of red corrugated iron with a white veranda of fantastic woodwork around the upper floor, and Fletcher led the way inside. Prout, unhappily aware of the mephitic vapours which enveloped him, was not anxious to linger in company and went off at once with the boy to have his shower and change. As soon as he had gone, Fletcher steered Ross, who had come in a moment later, over to the bar. "Well, Ross, that's a weird cargo you brought us. What did you make of it?" Typical bloody do-gooder. Reckons he and the Orleys will be pissing in each other's pockets in half no time. You could see that." "They may too." "How do you mean?" "Well, we knew this joker was coming, so we told the locals an old mate of ours was bringing 'em all kinds of goodies from the sky. I'll take him on a walkabout." "You ought to drop him down a shit house, Rog." "That's plan B. Plan A is that after a couple of months of the Morrick's sense of humour, he goes stark raving troppo and gets shipped out in a box with holes in it." "I reckon the first bloke who'll get shipped out is you, Rog." "The hell I will. Who's going to interpret it for him?" "Who knows the people? He's got to keep me on whether he likes it or not. Same goes for Ollie. You staying over till tomorrow?" "Yeah." "Well, don't forget tonight's piss-up night. I'll see you down here. Get Angelina to keep the prick busy till after dinner. I'll be up at Ollie's." And he strode quickly out of the bar and set his course for Ulrich's residence. Up in his room, as he tugged off his soiled clothes, Prout brooded on his humiliating entry to Ungabunga, his memory riveted on those hideous moments on the grass, that ruffian heaving and retching, the stench, and the fetid slime gluing his trousers to his legs. Faugh! He was a joke, a figure of ridicule, probably at this moment the butt of Australian crudities at the bar downstairs. But as he relaxed under the soothing waters of the shower, he reflected that they had little enough to laugh about, when their own headquarters had just been turned into a battleground. He dried himself carefully, feeling thoroughly cleansed. Yes, Absolute chaos. Fletcher had obviously lost his grip completely. The reports had seriously underestimated the social disintegration on the island. Restored, he pulled on a clean pair of flannels and slipped his stockinged feet into some open leather sandals, sank into an easy chair and unlocked his briefcase to prepare for his first official meeting with his new subordinates. Moya, Madame Negretti's chef from a neighbouring island, was in the kitchen, expertly preparing quiche Lorraine for lunch and whistling as he sliced the bacon. This was one of his favourite dishes, declared by the epicures of Ungabunga to be surpassed only by his suprême de voilà à la Maréchale. But, as the best piano tuners are said to lose their ear if they play the instrument to which their lives are devoted, so Moya never tasted the dishes he so dexterously prepared. The smell and texture were enough. His personal menu was drawn from the simpler repertoire of his tribe. At that very moment, a plump, juicy rat lay on the colander ready to be boiled for his lunch. He left the table and went to the larder for some eggs, but as he was putting them in a bowl, he heard a crash in the kitchen behind him. Running back, he saw Malvolio, Madame Negretti's cat, leap from the table with his dinner in its jaws. In an instant, the veneer of the cook was shed, and he became, as his fathers before him, hunters of the wild boar with bow and spear. Seizing a cleaver, he hurled it at Malvolio, crouching and growling behind the door, and nearly severed the brute's head. Bloody pussycat, he'd had it coming to him all right. Not the first time he'd nicked his dinner. But Mrs. would be angry. She loved it like his own women loved their baby pigs. Maybe she would call the sergeant and have him put into the calaboose. The vision of hunters in the primeval forest faded, and that of the chef resumed its place. What would he do with the body? Its fur now matted with blood that spread quickly over the concrete floor. Suddenly, he remembered that it was curry night at the Cosmopolitan. He grinned as the idea occurred to him, and in his culinary imagination, as he carried the corpse to the larder, Malvolio was already jointed and simmering in a rich broth. After an excellent lunch, Prout received word that he would be welcome at the office to discuss his plans with the resident magistrate. The policeman who delivered the invitation conducted him the few hundred yards and showed him up the steps into the office. Facing him was the heaving bulk of Ulrichs, seated at the centre of the table, while Fletcher sat at one end, tilting his chair back against an arms rack behind him, filled with Lee Enfields complete with bayonets in black scabbards and green canvas frogs. The inevitable newspaper cigarette hung from his lips. Since it was 8 inches long, about half a page from the Sydney Herald, he was obviously expecting an intellectually arduous afternoon. "I don't think you've met Mr. Ulrichs. Me right-hand man, Dr. Prout, the Special Commissioner." "How do you do?" said Ulrichs. "Pleased to meet you." "Well, Dr. Prout, we've been expecting you. Like to put us in the picture?" said Fletcher. "I certainly would. I may as well come straight to the point and speak frankly. From all of the reports I have studied, it's quite clear that your policies have resulted in social stagnation for the people. No schools, no democratic institutions, no improvement in the standard of living." "Yeah, but—" "Please, let me finish. I'm quite prepared to agree that Canberra must bear a great deal of this responsibility in view of this lax supervision, and I suppose since you obviously have no faith in the ability of these people to operate civilized institutions, your policies are consistent with your beliefs. But one might have expected that, as a practical man, you would at least have been able to maintain law and order. Yet this morning I was unable to land here at your own headquarters because the aerodrome was a seething mass well, what exactly is your explanation of the incredible violence which I saw?" "Just a land dispute being heard by the court. It's the way we settle things here." "What do you mean?" "Well, you see, we know bugger all about these jokers. Their minds don't work the same as ours. After a few years, you're thinking, You're getting to know 'em, and then one morning you wake up and you find you've had all arse about face from the word go. Very likely, I should think. Yeah, well, as I was saying, it's a bloody waste of time trying to apply our laws and customs to these blokes. You get a couple of tribes, next door neighbours most often. The men are always sneaking off into a bush for a naughty with the other blokes' wives, or nicking each other's pigs, or felling each other's trees out of spite. It goes on like this for a while, and the bad blood starts boiling up. So the chiefs get the sorcerers on the job. They get their bags of tricks out, and a few kids die of screaming abdabs, and an old granny or two goes potty, and some other bugger dies of the trembling toms. And before you say knife in the old days, they got their axes out, and we're hacking each other up like firewood. Right, says I. I don't want to know the rights and wrongs of it. And with all these bastards, they're all bloody wrong. Anyhow, any fighting, and you get clobbered. What do you mean by clobbered? Burning villages, shooting a few pigs, flogging the hard cases with wet cane, just to let 'em know I'm around and got my eye on 'em. I see. But what's all this got to do with the land disputes? Well, it's the same principle, isn't it? What the hell can we do when a couple of chiefs come up to us and one of them says that some piece of land was inherited from his father's mother's brother's wife, who used to live with his granny when her old man died, and the other chief says that she was never married in the first place, but just shacked up with him, and the land was never hers anyway because she'd accepted 2 pigs when she was younger not to make a claim on it. So we do the simple thing and we bring him down here to fight it out. Under police supervision, take their weapons off him and give him cudgels. And may the best side win. No one gets killed, usually. Anyway, the women and kids get an outing and bring us down some spuds and veggies. Smithy gets some patience and Ernie sells some booze. If he hasn't drunk it all himself, that is. And the Kanakis are happy because they've let off some steam, and the side that loses can always have another bash at getting the land back any time they like. This one today, Niavoro and Lava Lava, that's the second time in 18 months, isn't it, Orly? Anyhow, after the fight, they all bugger off home, their nasty little minds scheming and plotting the return match and what obscene names they can call other blokes. So there's no problem of law and order here. I see. Perhaps not. But your whole attitude, all your policies violate every article in the Declaration of Human Rights. If you could convince me that the Morocks were human, you might have a point. Ha 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 ha. Good God. I didn't come here to listen to this racist filth. All I've heard from you this afternoon is the most disgusting, reactionary, and uninformed nonsense. Their minds work differently from ours, indeed. It's long been established science that there are no differences between races in people's minds. The only variations are due to environmental factors, and they are as slight as they are superficial. My mission here is to change that environment by raising their standard of living and giving them democratic institutions and social justice and independence from colonial rule. The disgusting brawling which you encourage is merely a symptom of environmental stress and frustration at their lack of opportunity to realize those capabilities which they share with the whole of humanity. You have encouraged every man to raise his hand against his neighbor, actually to glory in it, for God's sake, instead of encouraging mutual trust and community harmony. Because they are culturally disadvantaged due to circumstances beyond their control, you sneer at them. Why, you probably kick them. Hell no, that's what I keep the police for. My God. Well, I tell a lie. I do kick me wives sometimes to keep 'em happy. Your wives? Yeah, sort of. Not legal or anything, but the Orleys think I'm one of their gods come back to earth, so they don't press the finer points of the law. When I'm on patrol and I find a decent-looking Mary with a chief for her father, I give him a few quid and he brings her down here for a while. If she gets up the duff, she shoots through to her old man again. She does very well out of it while she's here. The chiefs want to keep in with me. I can twist the chief's arm and that way we keep in touch with what's going on. This catalogue of exploitation was way too much for Prout. His chair upset with a crash as he leapt up and strode out through the open door of the veranda, where he paced up and down in silence for some time. "Poor Prout, you're being a little bit too brutal. We'll have him doing something silly in a minute, like saying he's going to do without us, come what may. Yeah, it may come to that, but he's got to find out sometime. So maybe it's better to give it him in one good dose at the beginning. Give him time to digest it." "I hope you're right." After a while, Prout returned, his face composed, and, picking up his chair, he resumed his seat and took a deep breath before addressing the RM again. "The pilot told me you were a practical man, Mr. Fletcher. I begin to see what he meant, but don't you think it rather demeans your rank by turning your residence into a brothel? It's a funny kind of brothel, with only one customer and all free. If you really want to see a whorehouse, there's one on the station for the police, just behind Ernie's store." "Really? Most interesting. Tell me about it." "I'll take you down and introduce you if you like. As you may have guessed, the police are not what you would call intellectually inclined, so they get bored when they've been back on the station for a few days. Before we set up the puss-puss shop, they'd slope off and start rogering the local Marys, have a few punch-ups with the menfolk who found them on the job, and come back with galloping knot rot into the bargain. Clap's endemic around here, so we roped in a few Marys, fixed a standard tariff, not many items, very unimaginative lot, and have Smithies inspect 'em regular, so everyone's happy. Luckily, we've had no bloody missionaries to kick up a fuss for years." "Were there any? I've never heard of a South Sea island without missionaries of some sort." "Oh yeah, some stupid flamin' Yanks. What the hell were they called, Ollie? The Cast Your Bread Upon the Waters mission, if I remember rightly." "That's it. Bloody loonies, the lot of 'em, led by a bloke called Frankfurter. Vegetarians. Tried to get the people to kill their pigs as unclean and live on coconut juice." "Yes," said Ulrichs. "They had a theory that meat inflamed the passions and that solid food of any kind caused an awareness of bodily functions that was eminently displeasing to God. Since coconuts don't grow up here, they had a rather thin time of it, I recall." "Did they starve to death?" asked Prout. "Probably would have done, except I got 'em first. Best charge I ever laid. Always remember it. That you, Herbert Martin Frankfurter of Ungabunga, did with force of arms most grievously disturb the peace of our sovereign lady the Queen, her crown and dignity, in that you, the said Herbert Martin Frankfurter, did feloniously seize 5 pork chops, a steak, a kidney pie, and a German sausage, the property of Ernest English of Ungabunga. They'd all been living on tin carrot juice for 3 months, so no wonder they were flamin' troppo. Fit to be tied, the lot of 'em. Came down from the mission, bright yellow, and rollin' their eyes looking like 3 mad Chinamen. Vitamin B poisoning, Smithy said. Ernie'd just got his freezer goods from Rabal, and they went for him like mad dogs. Poor bastards got out the back door with his shirt half off his back. Well, anyhow, the sergeant major and I quietened them down and shipped them out. Been peaceful ever since." "Yes, well, I'm quite relieved. There's enough superstition in the world without missionaries adding to it. What we need here are facts and clear thinking, and the United Nations is here to provide them. It's obvious that as regards policy, there is no communication at all between us. But I've decided that while I totally disapprove of your methods and attitudes, as a practical necessity, I shall have to ask if you are prepared to remain on a temporary basis for the time being, under my immediate supervision, of course. I am not so naive as to imagine that I can do my job, even with my staff, if I have no one who knows the people and can liaise with them. Are you both prepared to stay under those conditions?" "We imagined you'd be bringing your own experts, Dr. Prout, and would have no need for us, so we hadn't expected to stay on," Ulrich said. "Oh, of course, I'll be bringing a large staff of experts, but local knowledge is indispensable in a case like this. I think we all understand one another. I'm very disturbed by what I found here, obviously, and I'll probably be still more disturbed as I learn more. But much of the blame lies with Canberra for their laxity. As I say, you are both free to stay on at your present salaries under my orders for the next year. By that time, if all goes well, independence will be approaching and we should be able to go our separate ways. I think Mr. Ulrichs and I better have a word in private before we give you a decision. That's quite all right. I'll step outside for a few minutes. He nodded and returned to the veranda. Well, dear boy, that all went very nicely, said Ulrichs. We better give him a few minutes outside to make him think we're having trouble making up our minds, though. Yeah, we'll call him back when I've rolled me a cigarette. Give him the good news. You didn't say much. What'd you make of him being a fellow Pom and all that? Well, certainly a fine specimen of the high-minded interferer, but not a man to be underrated. No fool within his limits, and he knows it. So I think we should play on his vanity. Let him think we accept his one, that the old order has gone for good, and that we only want to spend the rest of our time here in peace and quiet, clinging to our rapidly vanishing privileges. Yeah, he should swallow that okay. Righto, I'll call him back. Dr. Prout! After a few moments, Prout entered and resumed his seat. Well, Mr. Ulrich and I have agreed that times have changed and there's no point in whinging about it. So it'd suit us to stay on and work for you for a bit. Good. Very sensible. I thought you'd see it like that when you'd thought it over. I'll leave you in charge of routine administration, though of course all judicial matters will have to be discharged under my supervision. There is one other thing. I'll be returning to Rabaul in a few days to organise my staff, but while I'm here I should like to have a closer look at the people, try to get an idea of their problems, so I should like to go on a brief tour of inspection with you, if that could be arranged. Oh yeah, no trouble. When do you want to leave? Would tomorrow be all right? Yep, 3 days patrol suit ya? I think so. Can you ride a horse? No, I can't, I'm afraid. I never had the chance to learn horseback riding. What about a motorbike? A motorbike? I really don't approve of that. You see, mechanical devices create more barriers between us and the Indigenous people than anything else. In fact, only last year I published a paper on the racist implications of air conditioning in the tropics. Most interesting, Dr. Prout, said Ulrichs. Perhaps you are also familiar with the most stimulating paper by Wilbur Smallpiece, if I remember rightly, on the fascist connotations of table linen in developing countries. No, I'm afraid not, but it sounds very perceptive. Could you let me have the reference? By all means. I'll look it out, although I'm fairly sure it was in the American Anthropologist. Well, Dr. Prout, said Fletcher, it looks like you'll have to walk it. So you won't see much of the country in 3 days. I realise that, but the more intense quality of the relationship that I shall attain with the people by walking will be ample compensation. Oh, yeah? Well, you should know. I'll get it laid on for you. Excellent. I won't detain you any more, but I should like to have a look at a few basic records. Census data, court records, and so on. Certainly, said Ulrichs. If you'd like to come through to the other office, I'll get them out for you. Prout finally left with a number of volumes and spent the rest of the afternoon in his hotel room studying them carefully. At last, his investigation complete, and he lit another cigarette. Very curious, he thought. Fletcher's regime had clearly driven the Marocs to violence. Indecent assault, riotous behaviour, arson, rape, and malicious wounding figured prominently in the court records. But there was not a single case of willful murder or even manslaughter in the whole 10 years covered by the volumes he had just examined. So how come the people have been so successfully restrained from homicide when every other form of violence was so common? It didn't make sense. Unless, was it possible that the records had been deliberately falsified? But why? After some time, a revolting possibility occurred that made him begin to see Fletcher in a very different and truly criminal light, and if he were right, he would not rest until he had brought the man to justice. Chapter 4. Dinner that evening at the Cosmopolitan was not a success, in spite of the excellent curry. Madame Negretti was not her usual ebullient self, being grieved and anxious over the disappearance of Malvolio. "Bush Kanakas, them bad buggers past all, missus," Moya had said in his most unctuous tones. "Them kai-kai pussycat, sure thing." Prout did his best to entertain the company with reminiscences of his university life at Manchester, but those recollections of wit and brilliancy for which Manchester was celebrated were tinged with melancholy in the very fact of being retrieved from memory. Those days once so tangible, and yet now so far beyond recall. Fletcher and Smith exchanged notes on infestations of body lice with professional relish, and Ernie fell down the stairs. But in spite of these diversions, it was with some relief that the party dispersed to bed soon after 10 o'clock. The next morning was brilliant and clear, and Prout stepped out of the hotel door after breakfast with a look of eager anticipation, shouldering his rucksack for the walk up to the fort. Fletcher and Sergeant Oala were outside the fort gate making a final check of the patrol boxes, directing the 6 policemen who stood close by, some leaning on their 303s. After Prout and Fletcher had exchanged greetings, Prout said, "Well, it's after 8. Shouldn't we be moving?" "No carriers yet. I've sent the corporal to rouse 'em." "Carriers? But surely the police will carry everything that is necessary." Fletcher was in an unusually ill humour, since he had slept badly and last night's curry had brought on a nasty attack of his piles. "The police? For God's sake, they're fighting men, not coolies. How do you expect 'em to keep order and respect if they're lumbering with cooking pots and bloody bedding?" Prout was taken aback. "Well, I wouldn't know about that, but I can't tolerate this kind of exploitation. What my wife would say if she saw me lording it over a gang of native porters, I shudder to think." Fletcher exploded. "I couldn't give a bugger what she'd say. If you won't go by horse and you won't go by bike, we've got to have carriers. If you won't have carriers, you can bloody well stay at home. So make up your mind, will ya?" "I have already explained my wishes. Will you please tell the police to carry the boxes and forget this nonsense about carriers?" "If you want to insult my police, you tell 'em yourself." Flushed with rage, Prout turned to the police, who had been watching the growing anger between the 2 white men with perplexity and embarrassment. "You men there will be no carriers today or at any other time. You will carry the boxes yourselves. Hurry up now, we must get moving." He gesticulated and spoke rapidly in a higher pitch than usual. The police shifted uneasily and looked at each other, then to Fletcher for guidance. He winked and grinned at them. "You might as well save your breath. They don't understand a ruddy word you're saying. Do you want to get on this patrol or don't you?" Seeing the blank incomprehension in the eyes of the police and catching the grin with which Fletcher had reassured them, Prout hesitated and bit back the flood of humiliated rage that was about to spew over them all. He was beaten, but still had enough self-control not to make a complete fool of himself. "Very well, I obviously have no choice, but at least I shall carry my own rucksack." He turned away and looked fixedly across the valley. Fletcher said to the police, "Master, he no savvy talk belong you me. Him he say you fellow police lose him carrier, so walk about belong master or bugger up." The police laughed. Just as Fletcher was about to bellow down to the jail, Corporal Barragy and the 8 convicts who were to carry for the patrol could be seen coming at the double. In less than a minute they had caught up to the patrol and began shouldering the poles which had been passed through the handles of the 3 big galvanized patrol boxes, 2 men to a pole, while the last 2 carriers gathered up an assortment of odds and ends, a couple of folding canvas chairs, hurricane lamps, bowls and buckets. And without more ado, the police set off up the left-hand track behind the fort with Sergeant Oala leading. After wandering for many miles through the mountains, the track returned by a different route to the station, where it completed the circle. As Prout turned to look at the policemen, they grinned at him cheerfully and settled their rifles for the long climb, holding them by their muzzles over their shoulders. "We go in the middle," said Fletcher. Prout hoisted his rucksack onto his back, and the carriers, with CPL Barragy and another constable bringing up the rear, followed them out of the station. The patrol wound its way up the track at a brisk pace. Fletcher maintained silence out of anger and contempt for Prout, and Prout, under the growing weight of his rucksack, found that he had little breath left to talk. Every now and then his boots slipped off water-polished boulders as they crossed a stream bed, making him stumble, or turned over as he placed a foot on some uneven ground, causing him to stagger sideways with the pain in the calluses of his feet. Specks of diamond-hard grit were thrown up by his boots and lodged in the tops, quickly working their way down to the soles of his feet, which soon felt red-hot with the unaccustomed irritation. The track at this stage traversed an almost waterless part of Mount Browning, and as the streams ran only in a brief spate after rainstorms, the beds were now bone dry. The spur faced east, and by 10 o'clock the sun was beating hotly down upon the mountainside. Only coarse grass grew here, since all the trees had long been burnt off by the natives to make gardens which had themselves been abandoned many years before. Prout's saliva began to dry up and turn into a thick white slime that coated the inside of his mouth. It ran down the back of his throat and formed a froth under his tongue. He began to hawk and spit to try and dislodge it, and his breathing became louder and hoarser. The straps of his rucksack cut into his flesh, and his shoulders ached dully with the effort of sustaining its weight. To keep up appearances, he gasped at Fletcher. "Those rocks up ahead are very interesting shape. Yeah, that's where we'll have a sipperly." "A what?" "A spell, a smoko. Not far." The rocks, an outcrop of yellow-grey granite, blasted and splintered by dynamite when the track had been put through, marked the crest of the ridge up whose side they were toiling. Beyond the pinnacles, the track turned sharply into the next valley. Prout began to estimate the distance still to be covered. Perhaps a mile. At 3 miles an hour, that should take 20 minutes. Thank God. He ought to be able to hold on till then. The path turned right, into another re-entrant. For the umpteenth time, this was unusually steep-sided, shadowed and echoing, but with no trace of water. They picked their way across the ruckle of boulders at its centre. Prout stumbled badly, and the breath was jarred from his body as he gasped and staggered and barely managed to keep his feet. Before he could recover it, he found the path rising more steeply than ever. His legs drove down like pistons as he dug in his toes, his breath coming in a series of grunts and wheezes. Under his armpits, dark stains spread over his shirt, reeking sourly of sweat and reaching more than halfway to his belt, while under his pack, his shirt was clinging and sodden. The gap between the police and himself was widening as they drew away with easy strides, while the carriers, seemingly unaware of their swaying burdens, pressed upon him and Fletcher, who was content to adjust his pace to Prout's. As they emerged from the re-entrant and rounded the next corner, the rocks appeared again on the horizon, perhaps a little nearer. The altitude was beginning to take effect, as they were now at more than 5,000 feet. He could feel his pulse beating in his temples, and his vision periodically grew dim. The roar of the Ungabunga River, thousands of feet below, advanced and receded like waves on the seashore. The path swung into another re-entrant, and the rocks vanished from sight again. A sudden gust of scorching wind from the valley below roared over the path, driving up a cloud of dust and sand. Prout put his hand over his eyes and caught his foot on a boulder, stumbling and almost falling again. His sweat poured out in torrents. The second pair of carriers passed them. The stream bed in the gully was the steepest so far, and the rain of 2 nights before had produced a considerable spate that had badly damaged the track, tearing away a section until only a narrow ledge was left for passage, and even this was several feet below the level of the path. As Prout, now staggering, came up to this obstacle, moaning and wheezing, the rest of the carriers slipped past and dropped nimbly into the stream bed with their loads, vaulted up onto the other bank and disappeared round the next corner. Gasping, Prout sank to his knees and gingerly put one foot over the edge of the bank. The path here was scarcely 2 feet wide and formed the lip of a great dry waterfall, Oibori Nibori, whose precipitous faces were sounded by the rocks, which Prout dislodged, crashing and volleying until they were lost in the vegetation far below. Slowly, facing inwards to the cliff, he edged his way across, his knees shaking, the weight of the rucksack unbalancing him all the more easily due to the agony in his feet. The far side was steeper and needed more concentration and agility than he commanded. He put his left foot blindly on what was no hold at all, grabbed for the rim, and as he raised his other leg, the gravel gave way and he fell back with a shriek of terror. Fletcher caught him and pressed him against the side of the cliff. After giving him a moment to regain his composure, Fletcher put his hand under Prout's foot and heaved him up over the edge. As Fletcher followed him up, their eyes met. Fletcher's gaze was remote and impersonal. As they rounded the next bend, Prout saw that the rocks had come appreciably nearer and that the track was level and fairly broad. In another half an hour they reached the resting place and found the police and carriers sitting and smoking in the shade or lying half asleep. Prout threw off his rucksack and collapsed like a dead man. It was nearly 2 hours after he had first seen the rocks. "Water," he begged. "For God's sake, isn't there any water?" "No, another half an hour," said Fletcher. "Anyhow, it'll do you no good to drink water. Just slop about your guts and slow you down." He went over to a bag and took out some oranges. "Have one of these." Prout took it silently and ravenously tore off the skin, cramming the segments into his mouth so that the juice ran all down his chin. "Thanks, that was very good. Would you have another by any chance?" As Prout ate the second orange, Fletcher rolled himself a short newspaper cigarette, which he puffed luxuriously in between bites of his own orange. From the rocks they could now survey the great valley which opened before them, its higher slopes thickly carpeted by rainforest. Both sides of the valley were broken by spurs which ran down to the river, a tributary of the Ungabunga, and on each of these spurs could be seen native villages of palm leaf thatched hovels, bleached almost white by the sun. But Prout was too dazed to take in any of this. He lay a broken and disgusting object in the shade, his belly rising and falling with his stertorous breathing. He did not notice Fletcher's signal to the carriers and police to be on their way, nor see him point to Prout's rucksack, and a carrier whisk it off to be stowed with the rest of the impedimenta. Some minutes after they had gone, Prout roused himself and began to take a passably intelligent interest in his surroundings. When he had surveyed the valley, he said, "How far do we go today?" "We'll be up at the first village by about 2:30 or 3. That's La Ripa. We'll have Kai there and hear the talk, have a kip and go on in the morning. The carriers will have a rest house ready by the time we arrive. Come on, we'd better get moving." Prout dragged himself to his feet, his wretched hot feet, and looked around for his rucksack. "Where's my pack?" "My pack," he said in a bewildered way. "The carriers took it on." "They what? How dare they?" "Just felt sorry for you. Anyhow, if they hadn't carried your pack, they'd have ended up carrying you instead." He forbore to mention that the carriers had taken the pack on his instructions, or that he had told the police before the patrol began to maintain the hottest possible pace to the rocks, with none of their usual breathers on the way. "But it's extremely valuable, supposing they drop it over a cliff." "Valuable my arse. I wish they'd bloody well drop you over a cliff. Now for Christ's sake, get a move on." And he walked off up the track without another word. Prout followed sullenly. The release from the crushing burden of the pack gave his legs a spring-like bounce that made him feel almost weightless. But if he was now spared the encumbrance of the pack, his spirits were weighed down by guilt instead. For, despite his best intentions, he was now an exploiter of native labour and, However unwillingly, he had become part of the vile colonialist machine. He had, at the outset of his mission, endangered that fragile bond of respect which he needed to build between himself and those entrusted to his care. His self-flagellating reverie was disturbed by 2 rifle shots and the notes of a bugle up in front. "Is that your police attacking some poor villagers?" "No, worse luck. Just letting Laripa know we're coming and telling him to get firewood cut and water from the creek." "Why the shooting?" "To remind Orley we're the bosses." "Is that all you can think of? Oppression and racial violence?" Fletcher tossed the butt of his cigarette into the valley below and walked on in silence, smiling to himself. Laripa was distinguished among the settlements of the Morocco by the presence of the greatest orator, Malik, the greatest sorcerer, Makardit, and the greatest philosopher, Gurang, a twisted, hairless little man with a squint. It was thus a kind of Florence or Paris, a cultural centre where the aspiring young intellectuals of the Morocco came to learn the secrets of their fathers and, more hidden still, the dark revelations of the before men who, led by Tikami himself, had roamed the mountains when time itself was not. As befitted its status as the cultural capital of the Morocco, its men's house was the largest, the best ornamented, and the most smoke-blackened in all of the island. Raised on piles, its rear was low, but the roof ridge rose into the sky so that, being more than 100 feet long, the top of its front end, the formal end, was nearly 40 feet above the ground. The boards covering the front of the house were brilliantly painted in the form of a great face, whose mouth was also the entrance. The teeth of the mouth were provided by 2 rows of bleached skulls, as the boiling and preparation of skulls was one of the arts for which Laripa was celebrated. Below the men's house, the hovels of the women formed 2 parallel lines for a couple of 100 yards down the crest of the spur. At the end of these 2 lines, a second, smaller men's house faced up the yard between the huts of the women, looking directly at the great face of the principal men's house. The yard was steep and slippery, of shiny red clay, and all around the village ran a high stockade of timbers, whose tops were carved into replicas of simian faces, or barbed to resemble spear points, or hacked and pruned into stranger, even more lethal shapes, curved and twisted like instruments of torture. The interior of the great men's house was lit only by those rays that penetrated the narrow entrance, and its natural obscurity was rendered the more impenetrable by the smoke which filled it, rising from the smouldering logs on the hearth of ashes running the entire length of the building. Inside the entrance, in the ashes, smoking his bamboo pipe, sat Nyakang, once the most renowned of the Laripa warriors, now little more than an old bag of bones looking out over his beloved mountains, waiting to die. Smoking was the last of this world's pleasures left for him. The government had stopped most of the axe murders at which he had been so proficient, and he had never been much good at sorcery. He'd always muddled the spells at the critical moment. Sex, well, that had been fun, but at least the government hadn't stopped that yet. But it was a long time since he had felt up to it. The last time, that had been a long time ago, when the great landslide swept away some of his pandanus trees. But all he got for his trouble was a splitting headache, and he'd given it up as a bad job ever since. Not that he was missing much as far as Tiopo, his last surviving wife, was concerned. She was almost as decrepit as him and never bothered to wash anymore. She was usually covered in dust, like an old gourd abandoned in the corner of a hut. It was ages, too, since he had led the killing of the pigs at the great dance. His teeth had mostly gone now, and he couldn't even chew a pig, let alone kill one. Soon he would be a spirit roaming the forests of the high ranges with his ancestors, without fire or food or hope. He still clung to life, not out of love for this world or fear of that to come, but from habit. His attention wandered back to Makardit and Malik, who were sitting outside the veranda talking. "A bat's wing without fresh dog's blood will blight naught," said Makardit. "Some say that a frog's head crushed with ginger root giveth more power than the blood of any creature, but that is folly. Malak nodded wisely. Dog's blood, thou sayest, I will mind it well. His fourth and most recent wife had been seduced by his cousin, so he had come to Makardit for a little private tuition in sorcery. The receipt for smiting an enemy's genitals with gonorrhea cost only a small pig. A larger one, of course, was required if the master himself recited the spells. Since his enemy was a cousin, the handier and cheaper remedy of the axe was denied him, but a good dose of clap would suffice to put the fellow in his place. Fresh blood, reiterated Makardit. If thou but use it, fresh blood, the bat's wing, and the words of power which I have given thee, and well besmear his codpiece with the remedy, there will be one pig that will not root in thy garden for a while. Makardit drew on his bamboo pipe, but found that in the long interval of conversation it had died. O aged one, give us thy pipe, he said over his shoulder to Nyakang. Slowly, a trembling arm was extended through the hole with the requested pipe. The Marocs never addressed an old person by name. They smelt of death, and their names were thus tabooed. Men talked freely in their presence, for they were in a sense unpersons, already dead to the social life around them. But all took care to treat them with respect. The elderly would soon be spirits, and their curses were powerful. No one wanted sudden blindness, or his food to choke him, or his pigs to waste and die. As the three men smoked in silence, passing the pipe between them, Garang approached. Before climbing the ladder up to the veranda, he blew his nose in his fingers and wiped the snot onto one of the posts supporting the house. When he had settled himself and drawn a few lungfuls of smoke from the bamboo tube, he said, Tikami cometh. We have all heard the bugle. Men say he bringeth an aged one, withered and lean-shanked, who came from the sky. Ay, is it he who was foretold, the bringer of riches? Asked Makardit. Who knoweth? We must put him to the test, for if he is the bringer of riches, he is surely one of us, a Marok, returned from the dead, from the great mountains, where the spirits wander forever. So my test is this, if there be one among us upon whom he smileth with a special favour, like a loving father upon the son in whom he taketh delight, he is the man's begetter, or his sire's begetter, or his grandsire's begetter, for no man smileth in such fashion upon a stranger, upon any who is not bone of his bone, his very kindred. So if this aged one, this spindle-shanked one, should show love for any of us, love, I say, and not the passing smiles of deceit, he claimeth that one as his very own, and we shall know that he is in truth that bringer of riches foretold by our fathers. The others, including Nyakang, were deeply impressed by the insight which Garang displayed. The matchless intellect that made Laripa respected and envied throughout the land of the Moroks seemed only to burn brighter with the years. Our men come from the forests with wood, our women from the gardens and creeks. When we are all met together, I shall speak, said Malak, and reveal thy words, O Garang. Ay, said the philosopher, strictly charge the men, the women, the wenches and the lads, even the little children, to watch this stranger, to look for the sign, for if it haply pass unseen or go unrequited, he will be angered and forsake us, never to return.